So, you want to be a Star Wars fan, or at least you are a Star Wars fan maybe, and you're looking to take that next step into continuing to watch more Star Wars movies or more Star Wars TV. You've come to the right place, because in this video, I will be giving you a complete guide on how to watch everything from the Star Wars franchise in both film and television. We'll be covering my essentials from both the film side and the television side, as well as giving you a complete chronological watching order at the very end in case you wanted to start all the way from the beginning of the timeline and go to the end of the timeline. And of course, there will be no spoilers. This video is aimed at people who have not seen everything, so we will not be talking spoilers in this video. I will make sure of it. In fact, I literally just restarted the video because I had a shirt that contained a possible spoiler. And so getting straight into it, let's look at my bare bones essentials, the fundamentals that hold together the entirety of this franchise. So this section is assuming you've seen absolutely nothing. You know no plot twists, you know no character turns, you don't know what happens. You want to know, what is this whole thing about? Why do people obsess about it? Why are there YouTube channels dedicated to Star Wars? So starting with the bare bones essential watch order, we're going to start with Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope from 1977, directed by George Lucas. Then continue to Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back from 1980, directed by Irving Kershner. Then Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, directed by Richard Marquand from 1983. This is what makes up what we call the original trilogy of Star Wars films. 16 years later, George Lucas directed Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. This is the first of the prequels and released in 1999. And then Star Wars Episode 2, released in 2002, titled Attack of the Clones. This one is also directed by George Lucas. And then finally, the last film of what we know as the prequel trilogy and the last film of what has been called the Star Wars saga is Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, also directed by George Lucas in 2005. As I just said, these are all the films either written, directed, or produced by George Lucas, and they make up the Star Wars saga as we knew it for a very long time. This is, in my opinion, a complete Star Wars experience. You don't need other TV shows to enhance it. You don't need other books to enhance it, or comics, or video games. This is what the auteur, who was George Lucas, built Star Wars to be. These are his 6 movies. So one of the frequently asked questions for beginners and one of the biggest jokes around Star Wars is, why do you start with Star Wars Episode 4? Well, that is a good question, and let me explain it this way. In 1980, The Empire Strikes Back would release, but instead of having an opening crawl that just went straight to the backstory text like you see in the original Star Wars film, the crawl began with the text Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, which is what began all this confusion. Why was the second movie now called Episode 5? Well, long story short, after making the original Star Wars in 1977, George began to solidify those ideas he originally had in his first outlines and his first scripts, while continuing to add new ideas that would become some of the foundational pieces of the entire Star Wars saga. After the success of the original Star Wars, and since George owned all sequel rights to his movies, George had so many ideas, and he was continuing to try to build and expand this world, which led him to develop a backstory for a lot of the characters that were in the original Star Wars film. Ultimately, that backstory gave George Lucas the idea to make not just 2 more Star Wars films in his original trilogy, but also an entire prequel trilogy. It was said in 1978, George solidified this decision, and he decided that the original Star Wars film was not the beginning of Star Wars, but rather right in the middle. So in 1980, when Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back released, he added Episode 5 to the film's crawl. Then in 1981, on April 10th, Star Wars re-released in the theaters for the first time with the subtitle Episode 4, A New Hope, basically solidifying the fact that there would be a prequel trilogy in the future. And I do recommend, especially for beginners, that you start in release order. Starting with Episode 4, 5, and 6 gives you the heart and soul of what Star Wars is, and it also preserves the biggest twists in the series. Now let's move on to what I call the expanded essentials, and ultimately the expanded essentials are the original Star Wars saga, plus things that I think directly enhance that Star Wars saga and help you get a better grasp on what George Lucas's Star Wars originally was, and also not to mention these projects all had George Lucas working on them. And so for the expanded essentials, we're going to also start with Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope, continue with Star Wars Episode 5 The Empire Strikes Back, then move to Star Wars Episode 6 Return of the Jedi, then Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace, Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, and then Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith. And here is where we are going to add more stuff. First, we are going to add Star Wars Clone Wars from 2003 to 2005. Star Wars Clone Wars is a 2D animated series, and it gives you bite-sized pieces, especially in Volume 1, of the entirety of the war. Now, Volume 2 is where it gets a little bit more story-focused. It focuses on 2 specific plot points that I won't reveal because I said no spoilers, but it also directly connects to Revenge of the Sith. The reason I would say don't watch it before Revenge of the Sith is I think if you're still a beginner, and this list is certainly still targeted at people who haven't watched much Star Wars, if any Star Wars, I think you should preserve the sanctity of watching these film trilogies in a row before jumping into a TV series that might take you kind of off the pace of watching these series. But watching Clone Wars will not only flesh out this conflict, which is so important to so many of the Star Wars films, but also give you a lot of information and backstory about transitionary phases for characters who change drastically between episodes 2 and 3. And that's not the end of Star Wars Clone Wars, because after you watch Star Wars Clone Wars, then you move on to what is known as Star Wars The Clone Wars. George was a producer on the show, and he pitched lots of story ideas for many different arcs, and ultimately he was the top dog. This was still Lucasfilm under George Lucas. He was the one overseeing this entire project. And that also leads to the 7th season having a different lead in to Revenge of the Sith than the original Star Wars Clone Wars. So there will be some like continuity things here, but ultimately I think both experiences do play well together. So with those expanded essentials out of the way, I think if you are just getting into Star Wars for the first time, that is the model you should follow. You should really go check all that stuff out, especially the original saga. And then you can come back to this video and check out the stuff that I'm going to be getting into next, which is what we call the Skywalker Saga. The Skywalker Saga is a term that Disney's ownership of Lucasfilm has given to episodes 1 through 9. So the next order I'm going to give you is the order of how to watch everything that has been made by both George Lucas in the original Star Wars Saga 6 film series, and then now Disney's 5 films that they have added to the Star Wars Skywalker Saga. Again, we're going to start with the original trilogy, episodes 4, 5, and 6, and then move into the prequel trilogy, episodes 1, 2, and 3. So here is where we're going to start to get into the Disney stuff. And I'm going to recommend starting with Solo: A Star Wars Story because it is the one that technically comes first in the timeline. It takes place about halfway between the 19-year gap between Revenge of the Sith and Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope, and it tells the origin story of Han Solo. Then you would go to Rogue One: A Star Wars Story, and this one is directly connecting to Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope. This film, and this is not really a spoiler since you're starting with Episode 4 A New Hope, this movie is about how the Death Star plans come into the hands of the rebels, which would then take you to the sequel trilogy, and you would start, of course, with Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens, directed by J.J. Abrams, then move to Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, directed by Rian Johnson, and then you would go to Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, directed once again by J.J. Abrams. So that is the Star Wars Skywalker Saga, and technically when you're talking about the Skywalker Saga, it doesn't include Solo or Rogue One, but if you're going to watch all the Star Wars live-action movies, you might as well watch them there. It's only 2 extra movies. So now we're going to get into the other reason you guys probably clicked on this video, and maybe one of the reasons you decided to watch Star Wars, and that is live action television. Live action television has been the main platform for Star Wars since 2020. There aren't going to be essentials for this. This is going to just be all of them in the chronological order that you would watch them. Without further ado, the order would be starting with The Acolyte, which released this year. It has 1 season and has been canceled. 1 season is all you're going to get of The Acolyte. And The Acolyte takes place far earlier in the timeline than the rest of these, so it doesn't connect to anything else. If you'd like to watch The Acolyte, you start with it, but if you don't want to watch it, you can move on to the rest of the stuff. Then next would be Obi-Wan Kenobi, which does directly connect to Revenge of the Sith, even though it takes place about 10 years after. Then you go to Star Wars' most acclaimed show so far, and that is Andor. As of the recording of this video, there is only 1 season of Andor. Season 2 is coming out next year in 2025, but I can say very confidently, knowing what we know about the character of Cassian Andor and when this show takes place. You can watch both seasons back to back here if you're watching this video in the future, and then you'll move on to the next show, which jumps after the original trilogy. But the next show would be Star Wars' most famous live-action TV show, and that is The Mandalorian. Now, The Mandalorian started an interconnected little TV universe between a bunch of different shows. I'm going to give you a watch order here for The Mandalorian that you just watch the first and second season here. There's a major thing that happens at the end of The Mandalorian Season 2, which directly plays into the next show, The Book of Boba Fett, which has 2 episodes that are completely dedicated to The Mandalorian and tell a massive plot point that really should have been in The Mandalorian Season 3. And if you don't watch The Book of Boba Fett and that plot point before you watch The Mandalorian Season 3, which will be next, then you will completely be lost on how this certain plot point is resolved. So make sure you watch Mandalorian Season 1 and 2, then Book of Boba Fett, then The Mandalorian Season 3. After that, you'll watch Ahsoka, which is connected to the Mandalorian universe. And as of the recording of this video, this last show has yet to be released, but from what we know, it is connected to the Mandalorian universe as well in the Mandalorian timeline, and that is Skeleton Crew, which is coming out here in a couple months. And so that would be the last show technically on the timeline order that you would watch. And so that is how you would watch live action Star Wars TV. Now you might be asking, what about Star Wars animation? And we will be getting to that next. But before we do that, I have to explain something very important to the world of Star Wars that is essential for a lot of people to know, and I think a lot of people need a little bit of a guide or refresher on this topic, and that is Star Wars Legends versus Star Wars canon. Disney decided to reset the Star Wars continuity in 2014, creating the 2 terms Star Wars Legends and Star Wars Canon. To simplify this for beginners, because this is a beginner's video, Star Wars Legends was everything that was created for Star Wars prior to 2014 when the initial split happened. The split started with a book called A New Dawn by John Jackson Miller, and then everything published in Star Wars Publishing, every video game created for Star Wars Gaming, and every TV show and film created after that point in 2014 ultimately became what Disney was calling the Star Wars canon, or everything that was built on the backs of what their Star Wars was. There were a couple exceptions to the 2014 rule, most notably the original 6 Star Wars movies, which are the foundations of Star Wars. So they had to be in both continuities. So they are considered legends and they are considered canon. The other big exception was the Star Wars The Clone Wars TV show, the 3D animated show that was run by Dave Filoni and also featured lots of input, like I said earlier, from George Lucas. So I gave the distinction between Star Wars Legends and Star Wars canon because unlike live action TV, which is all Star Wars canon because it's all been made by Disney, there are plenty of TV shows that were made prior to Disney's acquisition of Star Wars that are not part of Disney's continuity. And I include them all here because I know a lot of people out there do not care about Legends or canon. They just want to watch it all. That's great. I think you should watch it all. I have watched it all. You don't necessarily need to worry about the continuities. But if you are somebody who's like, this contradicts this, I don't understand why these 2 things are together, well, that is because there are 2 different Star Wars continuities. So with all of that said, that takes us to the Star Wars animated TV shows. And this is the order you should check them out. Just like with The Acolyte, there is a period of Star Wars called The High Republic, which has been dominating Star Wars books and comics recently. There is an animated children's show called Young Jedi Adventures. This is, again, by no means essential, but it is the earliest point in the timeline, so you could start with that. Now, here is where we get to the animated shows that most people actually watch, and that is going to start with Star Wars Clone Wars. Again, this is only Star Wars Legends. So if you care about the continuity and you're watching canon only, skip this. If you care about the continuity and you're watching Legends only, watch this. If you don't care about the continuity at all, definitely watch this because I love this show. Star Wars The Clone Wars from 2003 to 2005. You should not watch all of it here. Now, if you're watching this on Disney Plus, which is the most easily accessible way to watch it, and I assume that is probably where you are watching it, even if you're watching on the DVDs, this was released in 2 parts, Volume 1 and Volume 2. At this point, you would watch all of Volume 1, and then you would watch Volume 2, and I've given you the exact minute timestamp here, and I'll put it big on the screen, to 12 minutes and 47 seconds, because something big happens in the first part of Volume 2 that the Star Wars The Clone Wars show, the 3D animated show, already has happened in that show because of this show. So you have to watch up to that point, and then next you would move into Star Wars The Clone Wars. And since this is a simplified animated timeline, you would then watch the Star Wars The Clone Wars film that was theatrically released. Then you would move into Star Wars The Clone Wars. And because you're watching Star Wars The Clone Wars here, this is a long experience. Season 1 through 7. You should watch all the way up through episode 8 of season 7. So yes, do not watch the last 4 episodes yet. And once again, Star Wars The Clone Wars is both Legends and canon, although because the 7th season was produced by Disney and not by George Lucas, it is canon only and not Star Wars Legends, which then gives us the Star Wars Legends connection to Revenge of the Sith from Star Wars Clone Wars. This is the 2D animated series. You'd go back to Volume 2 and you would watch from 12 minutes and 47 seconds all the way to the end. Then you would go back to Star Wars The Clone Wars 3D animated series for season 7, and then you would watch episodes 9 through 12, which is the finale of the show, and also once again the bridge for this show into Revenge of the Sith. So it gets more simple after that, because then next you would watch Tales of the Jedi, which does jump around at different parts of the Star Wars timeline, but I would just recommend you watch it all right here if you're looking for a simplified order. Now you go to the other show, Tales of the Empire, and then you would watch seasons 1 through 3, the complete story of Star Wars The Bad Batch. Then you would watch seasons 1 through 4 of Star Wars Rebels. Then you would go to 2 Star Wars Legends only shows with Star Wars Droids and Star Wars Ewoks. Now, Droids technically takes place a little earlier in the timeline, but I just put them both together because they have similar animation styles. These are 80s Saturday morning cartoons. Droids only has 1 season, and Ewoks has 2. And then finally, you would get into the last animated series we have as of now, and that is going to be Star Wars Resistance. But you might be saying, hey, Liam, there are other shows out there that you didn't mention. And yes, there are. And I'm not going to include for this video, I should have stipulated that earlier, I'm not going to include a lot of the short form animations. It would just make it too complicated for beginners to put those in a timeline. So I wouldn't recommend you watch those unless you've finished everything and you're like, I really need more Star Wars, then you can check those out. But what I will say, and I'm not going to do a big long topic on this, is that there are TV shows, and this again will confuse you, that are considered non-canon. That means it's not Star Wars Legends. It's not Star Wars canon. This does not fit into the Star Wars continuity. They are not part of the official story of Star Wars. The last thing I'm going to give you guys, and this is going to be a little more complicated, but I tried to streamline this as best I could, and hopefully you guys understand it, but this is targeted a bit more at the people who have already seen the movies of Star Wars, already know a little bit about Star Wars, or you, if you are just starting Star Wars and then come back to this video later and you're looking to get into the full Star Wars experience. This is the complete chronological watching order. And yes, I am including everything that is considered Legends and everything that is considered canon. So looking at the chronological watching order, and yes, this is everything. The earliest part of the timeline right now is Young Jedi Adventures, which takes place over 200 years before the original Star Wars movie. Then you would move into The Acolyte, which has 1 season and has been canceled for any future seasons. Then you would move to Tales of the Jedi. Here you would just watch Tales of the Jedi season 1 episodes 2, 3, and then you would go back to 1. Then you would watch Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Then you would go back to Tales of the Jedi for Season 1, Episode 4. And then you would go to Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. And then you would get to the Clone Wars, which is the most complicated part of the timeline. You would start with Star Wars Clone Wars. And you would watch all of Volume 1, and then you would watch Volume 2, and like I said earlier, up to 12 minutes and 47 seconds, which would then take you to the 3D animated show, Star Wars The Clone Wars, and you would start with Season 2, Episode 16. Then you would watch Season 1, Episode 16, Hidden Enemy, and then you would watch the theatrically released film Star Wars The Clone Wars from 2008. You'd go back to Star Wars The Clone Wars, the 3D animated show, and here you would watch Season 3, Episode 1, and then Season 3, Episode 3. Now you would go all the way back to Season 1, you'd watch Episodes 1 through 15, and then skip Episode 16 because you've already watched it, and watch Episode 17 through 21. Do not watch Episode 22. Then you would watch Season 2, Episodes 1 through 3. Then you would jump to Episodes 17 through 19. Then you would go backwards to Episodes 4 through 14. And then you would jump ahead again to Episodes 20 through 22. Then you would go back to Star Wars The Clone Wars Season 3. And watch Episodes 5 through 7, go back to Episode 2, then Episode 4, then Episode 8. Now, here is where you'd go back to Star Wars The Clone Wars Season 1 to watch the last episode, Episode 22, and then you would go back to Season 3 for Episodes 9 through 11. Now you go back to Season 2 for Episode 15, and then you jump ahead again to Season 3 for the last episodes of the season, Episodes 12 through 22. And hooray, you finally get to Season 4 where you don't have to jump around. You would watch the entirety of Star Wars The Clone Wars Season 4 here, Episodes 1 through 22. Now you go to the other show, Tales of the Empire, Episode 1. Then you would watch Season 5, but again, you're going to jump around here. You're going to watch Episodes 2 through 13, then go back to Episode 1, then watch Episodes 14 through 20. Then once again, you get to go to Season 6, where you'd watch all 13 episodes in order, and then you'd watch Season 7, and you're going to start with Episodes 5 through 8, then go to Episodes 1 through 4, and then you go back to Star Wars Clone Wars Volume 2, starting from minute 12 and 47 seconds to the end of the volume. Now, here is where you go back to Star Wars The Clone Wars. Here is where you'd watch Season 7, Episode 9. Do not watch Episodes 10 through 12 yet. Then you would watch Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Then you would go back to the Clone Wars and watch Season 7, Episodes 10 through 12, which are the last 3 episodes of the show. Here is where you go back to Tales of the Jedi for the last 2 episodes of that show, and you would watch Episodes 5 and 6. Now you go to the other show, Tales of the Empire. And here, just like in Tales of the Jedi, you would only watch Episode 4. Now you get into The Bad Batch, and you would watch all 3 seasons here. Then you go back to Tales of the Empire and watch Episode 5, and then go backwards and watch Episode 2. Now you go to your first live-action Star Wars show since the beginning with The Acolyte, and you'd watch Obi-Wan Kenobi. Then you would go into Solo, a Star Wars story. Then you watch Droids, the Saturday morning cartoon from the 80s. Then you watch Andor, seasons 1 and 2. And then you would watch Star Wars Rebels, all 4 seasons. And I know this is frustrating, but once again, if you're trying to avoid all spoilers, you wouldn't watch the epilogue of Rebels finale, episode 15. You would stop at 42 minutes and 1 second. Then you would watch Tales of the Empire, Episode 6, and then you would move to Rogue One, a Star Wars story. Then you would watch Episode 4, A New Hope. Then you would watch, and this is a controversial one, and you can only find this on YouTube, this is the Star Wars Holiday Special. The Star Wars Holiday Special is from 1978, and it is considered part of the Star Wars Legends continuity, and it is extremely bad. I don't recommend you watch it, but if you didn't want to watch everything, you'd watch it here. Then you would watch Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. Then you would watch both seasons of the Ewoks Saturday morning cartoon TV show from the 80s. And after that, 2 more things we haven't talked about yet. You'd watch Caravan of Courage and Ewok Adventure and Ewoks The Battle for Endor. These were 2 TV movies about the Ewoks. And then you would get into Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. Then you would watch The Mandalorian Season 1, and then go back to Tales of the Empire Episode 3. Then you would watch The Mandalorian Season 2, then The Book of Boba Fett, then The Mandalorian Season 3. And here is where you'd watch the Rebels Season 4 finale epilogue, which starts at 42 minutes and 1 second, and you'd watch to the end. Then you would watch Ahsoka Season 1. Then you would watch Skeleton Crew Season 1. Then you would watch Resistance Season 1, and then get into the first 2 films of the sequel trilogy, Episode 7, The Force Awakens, and Episode 8, The Last Jedi. Then you would watch Resistance Season 2, and then finally, you would end all of this with Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. So thank you so much for watching this guide. I really do hope it helped you out. I tried to give you as many different ways you could watch Star Wars as possible to cover everybody's interests. I really hope it helped out. And if it did, Make sure you share this with other people you know are interested in getting into Star Wars. Give it a like. That helps me out so much. And subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. This is a channel where we love to talk about all things Star Wars. We don't put anybody down. This is a place for all Star Wars fans to discuss and talk about Star Wars. So hopefully you enjoy our channel. Thank you so much for watching this video, and we will see you all next time.